Have you ever wondered how you can perfectly recall the lyrics to some song you haven't heard in 20 years, but you have no idea what you ate for lunch yesterday? Or why you automatically snatch your hand back from a hot stove without even thinking about it? Well, those are exactly the kinds of questions that keep psychologists up at night. Today, we're going to dive into two totally different and honestly competing ways of explaining the huge mystery that is your own mind.
All right, so here's our game plan. We're going to start by cracking open the so-called black box of the mind with cognitive psychology. We'll map out its blueprint and go on a little journey through your memory. Then we're going to hit the brakes and pivot to a radically different view, behaviorism, to see how it says our actions get shaped. And finally, we'll put these two big ideas side by side to really see what's what.
Okay, so first stop, cognitive psychology. This whole field is basically on an ambitious quest, a mission, to figure out what is really going on inside our heads when we think, when we see, when we remember things.
I want you to picture this. You're walking down a busy street, you see a friend wave at you from across the way, and you wave back. Easy, right? But what actually happens in that tiny split-second gap between your eyes seeing the wave and your arm raising up to wave back? That little gap? Well, that's the whole puzzle that cognitive psychology is trying to solve.
And really, that's the core of it. Cognitive psychology is the science of all that invisible stuff, all those hidden mental steps that happen between a sensory input, like seeing your friend, and the behavioral output, you waving. It's all about the process that happens in between.
Now, to get their heads around this, the pioneers in this field came up with a really powerful analogy, and it's called the computer metaphor. Just think of your mind as a kind of biological computer. Information comes in, that's the input. It gets processed, it gets stored. And then our actions and words, that's the output. Simple, but a really useful way to frame it. So, if the mind is like a computer, you gotta ask, right? What does its operating system look like? What's the software it's running? Well, that's where something called the information processing model comes into play. This is basically the core blueprint for cognitive psychology. So this is our map. It kind of shows the path that information takes from the outside world through a few different memory stages, all the way until we actually do something. I know, it looks a little empty right now, but stick with me. We're about to fill this in piece by piece.
All right, so our journey starts at the very, very beginning. That first instant when our senses, our eyes or ears, pick up on something from the world around us. The first stop on the tour is called sensory memory. Now you can think of this as a huge but incredibly temporary holding area. It captures an unbelievable amount of information from your senses, but, and this is the key, it disappears almost instantly. We're talking less than a second for stuff you see, which is called iconic memory, and maybe just a few seconds for what you hear, or echoic memory.
Now, obviously, we can't deal with all of that information at once. I mean, can you imagine? It would be total chaos. So our brain needs a gatekeeper, a filter, to decide what's actually important enough to look at more closely. And that filter, you guessed it, is attention.
Okay, so whatever makes it past the attention bouncer gets into the VIP room, your working memory. This is your conscious mind. It's the mental workbench where you're actively thinking about stuff. But, and this is a huge but, it's tiny. The classic research says it can only hold about 7 chunks of info at a time. This is literally why phone numbers are 7 digits. It's designed to fit perfectly in your working memory.
And while you're in that mental workspace, your brain has kind of two different gears. There's automatic processing, which is stuff that just happens without any effort, like reading a word on a sign. And then there's controlled processing, which takes real effort and focus, like when you're scanning a huge crowd trying to find your friend.
You know this has happened to you. You walk up to a big glass door and you push, even though there's a giant sign that says pull. That is literally these two processes having a fight in your brain. Your automatic brain sees a handle and just wants to pull it, but your controlled, focused brain is trying to read the sign. That little moment of confusion, that's the conflict. And there it is. Our blueprint is complete. Information comes in through sensory memory. Attention grabs the important bits for short-term memory. Then, through a process we call encoding, it can get filed away in long-term memory. And when we need to remember it, we use retrieval to pull it back out. See? It's a neat, logical flow.
Okay, so we've just built this nice, tidy map of the mind. But what if it's completely misguided? What if the real key to why we do things isn't inside our heads at all? Get ready, because we are about to flip this whole thing on its head. This quote from John B. Watson, who's pretty much the father of behaviorism, is basically a declaration of war on the whole idea of cognitive psychology. He's saying,
Look, if we want to be a real science, we have to stop talking about this fuzzy, invisible mind stuff and focus only on what we can actually see and measure: behavior.
To a behaviorist, the mind is a black box, and their logic is simple. Since you can't see attention or weigh a memory, you just shouldn't even try to study them. The only thing that counts as real science, in their book, is looking at the observable things that go into the box, the stimuli, and the observable things that come out, the behaviors. That's it.
So if our inner thoughts aren't driving the bus, then what is? For the behaviorists, the answer is dead simple. We learn everything from our environment. Let's look at the two main ways they say our behavior gets shaped.
First up, you've probably heard of this one: classical conditioning. Ivan Pavlov and his famous dogs. It's all about learning by association. So at first, a bell is just a bell. It means nothing to a dog. But if you ring that bell every single time right before you give the dog some food, well, the dog starts to connect the two. Pretty soon, just the sound of the bell itself is enough to make the dog start drooling. A totally new reaction has been created, or conditioned.
And hey, this isn't just for dogs. In a pretty infamous and, let's be honest, ethically questionable experiment called Little Albert, John Watson showed this could apply to human emotions. He took a harmless little white rat, and every time the baby reached for it, Watson would make a loud, terrifying noise. After a few times, just seeing the rat was enough to make the baby cry. The conclusion was huge and kind of chilling. Even something as deep and complex as fear is just a learned behavior.
Okay, the second big mechanism is operant conditioning, and this is B.F. Skinner's territory. The idea here is that our behavior is shaped by what happens after we do it, by the consequences. So let's break this down. Reinforcement always increases a behavior. If you get praised for doing a good job, that's positive reinforcement, adding something good. You'll likely do it again. If you buckle your seatbelt and that annoying dinging sound stops, that's negative reinforcement taking away something bad. You're more likely to buckle up next time. Punishment, on the other hand, decreases behavior. Getting a speeding ticket is positive punishment, adding something bad. And getting your phone taken away is negative punishment, taking away something good.
So, here we are. We're left with two totally different and deeply conflicting stories about what makes us human. One side wants to get inside that black box and draw a map. The other says don't even bother looking inside. Let's put them right next to each other.
So here it is, the fundamental split. Cognitive psychology says, yes, let's go inside the black box. Let's build models of the mind software to figure out why people do what they do. But behaviorism stands firm outside and says, nope, all that matters is what goes in and what comes out. Behavior is just a product of what the environment has taught us. These are two completely different ways of answering that one huge question: why do we do the things we do?
And that leaves us with one last thing for you to think about. Right now, in this very moment, as you're processing everything we've talked about, is what's happening in your head best explained by that cognitive flowchart: attention, encoding, retrieval? Or is your act of watching and learning simply a conditioned response, shaped by years of reinforcement for paying attention in situations like this? Cognition or conditioning? Which one do you think is really running the show for you right now?